Our political commentators are in the studio with me. Kia ora korua to Ben Thomas and Gareth Hughes.
Kia ora morena.
Morena.
Ben is a former National Party government press secretary, a columnist and a director of the public affairs firm Capital. Gareth is director of the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, Aotearoa, a former Green MP, no longer a member of any political party. Thanks for coming in. So let's begin. We've had some attention on the Prime Minister's speech as National Party leader to Party Faithful at the weekend. It had a KiwiSaver policy that I don't think people had anticipated. We can talk about that specifically. But also it comes at a time where his ratings remain under scrutiny. His personal polling, I guess, in the public polls rather than the parties. And there seems to have been rather feverish speculation by the great and the good at a couple of events, Ben Thomas, over whether, there might be a move on his leadership. What do you make, first of all, of what happens from time to time when you get these kind of feverish outbursts of it's all on, and trying to measure their credibility or otherwise?
Yeah, I think there's been a couple of instances of chatter, as you might like to call it, this year. The first was back in February, March, around the time of the Bailey resignation and that sort of nightmare interview with Mike Hosking. And the
why don't you just answer a question? Why don't you just say X?
And the sort of the kind of the white noise of the chatter sort of increased like locusts in summer, and then it subsided a couple of weeks later. We've had another sort of outburst. Maybe that's tied to urgency and some unhappy MPs sort of, contemplating their life decisions, stuck in Parliament for a long time till midnight. But certainly, that level of background noise has increased. And look, Luxon has well-known challenges with regard to his leadership. There's no secret about that. His personal polling is really only relevant in as far as it seems to tie directly back to National's decreased polling. They started the year with a sort of nightmare run of polls around 30%, built that back up into the sort of low mid-30s generally, but now back around that 30% level and, at least one poll under 30, which is an extremely dangerous psychological kind of line to cross. And again, both, hard to extricate.
Let's remind people also that you may end up being the person to form the coalition, but there's a bunch of seats that go that your caucus are reflecting on.
That's right.
Yeah.
You wouldn't be at panic stations in any part of the coalition government right now in terms of losing power after the election. You would still think there's probably enough potential upside.
You'd be looking about your own place on the list, say.
But there are a lot of people in the National Party who, first of all, either will lose their seats, certainly under current polling or even slightly higher polling. And there are some questions, for instance, the list becomes a bit dicey, although you would normally expect that you'd lose a few electorate seats as well. But then that's kind of counterbalanced by the fact that Labour is not exactly surging either, despite being the most popular single party right now. So look, there are questions about Luxon's leadership. They do come up quite a bit. The things that, the thing that really seems to delay any kind of real momentum for action on this is that he's almost sort of paired in a kind of quantum physics way with Chris Hipkins, like they're two, sort of subatomically linked microcharismatic particles whose failure to sort of really get any clear distance from each other, either in personal polling or their parties, tends to mitigate against either of them being sort of moved on by their parties.
Gareth, what that's a tough act to follow there. But if they decide to do this sooner rather than later, get it done, over summer or people are away, not thinking about politics anyway, or would it be an insane thing to do? It's a rare thing to do, to roll a sitting Prime Minister.
Well, to keep Ben's metaphor going, maybe it's a bit like Xu Jinlu's book, Three Body Problem. When you add a third body, which is Winston Peters and the rise of New Zealand First, you can't predict anything. It brings instability into the system. And look, this is one of my theories of New Zealand politics, is we're kind of 5 to 10 years behind Australia, the UK. Maybe this is the beginning of the real political instability where actually, as you intimated, Kathryn, National hasn't really rolled a Prime Minister Minister since Jim Bolger back in the late 90s with Jenny Shipley. And even then it was positioned as a sort of handover.
Refreshing.
Yes. National just doesn't have a history of doing this to Prime Ministers. Yes, they change leaders and they've swapped horses during opposition, but maybe this is the political instability coming for New Zealand. And
it tends to happen in opposition. So Labour had it when Clark stood down and had that churn of leaders. National had it in opposition as well. I'm just trying to remember how many that went through before Luxon, to his credit, seemed to calm the farm and then help win them an election. Are you intimating that what's happened in the UK to sitting Prime Ministers and to Australia's sitting Prime Ministers might be coming our way?
Exactly. That point exactly. You know, we've been used to real political stability, multi-term prime ministers. Perhaps that end of the golden weather is coming to an end. Now, for National, you know, we're 12 months out from the election pretty much. We don't know the exact date, but it's probably going to be somewhere around November next year. It's kind of like all the Christmas trees and Christmas carols coming up. We know Christmas is around the corner. The politicians know the election is probably just around the corner, and that really does refine the mind.
Here are some counter-arguments. Rolling as sitting a Prime Minister can annoy the electorate, right? He's there as a result of an election. We don't elect Prime Ministers in this country, we elect parties, but he was there as head of the party when it was elected. That can annoy the electorate.
And I'm just being a devil's advocate here, but in the past, you know, in MMP, when we've had these sort of presidential-style elections, we've had very popular Prime Ministers.
So you're saying Helen that could Clark be a rationale for doing it?
Helen Clark was a very popular Prime Minister while she was Prime Minister. John Key, obviously incredibly popular. Jacinda Ardern, on average, very popular, had sort of peaks and troughs. And in those governments, you would never have any kind of ambiguity if you were a backbencher or an electorate MP that you were there because of John Key or Jacinda Ardern.
So second point, you're back to the leadership instability story that's only just settled for National. And someone won't like this happening, and all the backstabbing and the leaking and everything else, you risk starting that off again. Third thing, it is an unusual coalition. It's the first coalition government with 3 signed up members all sitting around cabinet. And in some ways, can the qualities, in inverted commas, that people criticise Luxon for, are they also part of that stability? And if you've got a different leader, could you risk the coalition itself becoming unstable?
Absolutely. And, you know, if this happens, it just adds an element of panic, which the voters could punish. But you're right, it's the coalition negotiations and relationships, which I don't think it's exaggerating to say if there was a change of leader, there is a plausible risk of a snap election. We saw that again with Jenny Shipley rolling Jim Bolger and the relationship with Winston Peters in that Labour government. And basically you saw a whole bunch of MPs desert from New Zealand First at that period, Tauhenere and others. So there's a real risk that something like that happens again, or that Winston Peters, which has been pretty resurgent this term, polling numbers looking good, decides I signed a deal with Christopher Luxon. Yes. Actually, I'm going to go to the polls.
I think that's less of a risk in the sense that Winston Peters remembers what happened after the government collapsed in the 1990s. He's put a very high premium on sort of stability. David Farrer did some very interesting polling with Curia, showing that ACT voters were the most likely to punish their own party, to punish a party that deserted from the coalition. But those numbers were pretty high for all of them. And National, of course, turkeys don't vote for early Thanksgivings, and so I don't think the collapse of the government is the risk. The risk is more the workability of the government.
Well, just the perception of the public over whether this thing is worth electing, this government is worth re-electing.
I don't know if it would trigger that in and of itself, but I think as you alluded to, whatever you think of Luxon's, management style and, his leadership, he certainly is willing to give a lot of latitude to his coalition partners
and to his own ministers, actually, which he's one of the things he gets praise for from within his party, but not outside necessarily.
And here I'm talking less about sort of policy and more about the public pronouncements and the challenges to his own authority. He affects this kind of 50s housewife sort of, what was that? Oh, sorry, I didn't catch that kind of vibe vibe, and that maintains that peace there. Now, would a successor have the same sort of reserve to do that? And interestingly enough, I think that might actually give Luxon a bit of a unique advantage here. I mean, it is, leadership questions and speculation do have their own momentum. You do get, you start getting questioned about it on the tiles. Things can sort of go south pretty quickly. In Luxon's case, he seems the most likely of our most recent prime ministers to just sort of ignore that. People will say, well, we've had named potential successors. What do you think of that? And Luxon can just go, sorry, I didn't read it. And he might be able to. Yeah. I think that's one criticism that there has been within the caucus of Luxon, is that he sort of tends to just kind of glide over the bad polling and the bad results. But that could be a strength here.
But this is the thing, even if they're just rumours at this stage, and even if there is no challenger who's wanting to step up and challenge his leadership, it risks a momentum of its own, and potentially it could manifest itself. And for a Prime Minister who's facing difficult coalition negotiations, pretty dismal polls, an unhappy caucus, it must be pretty hard for the National Party that sees themselves as the mainstream party, the permanent almost government in waiting, to be looking at polls under the 30s, to be reliant probably on two parties to form the next government. So the risk is, and for Luxon himself, does he want to keep answering questions about this? Perhaps there is a plausible scenario where he says, well, bugger it, I've got better things to go do, and actually to keep a bit of his mana, have a bit of a handover rather than a coalition. The fact is we're talking about all these scenarios, I think, shows that these rumours are gaining momentum, even if they're not looking absolutely likely.
Okay, the ferries announcement came out last week. I'll get you to talk specifically. There's still a lot of a focus on what the port site costs obviously will end up being, because that ended up being a big part of the blowout of the first option. But alongside this, we've had Mr Peters not only making this announcement, but being fairly forthright himself, pledging to repeal the Regulatory Standards Act legislation that he'd only just voted for, saying it'd be repealed under a future government. He was pretty strong in his words on Pike River after the Pike River campaigners visited the Minister for Workplace Safety, also an ex-MP. We had David Seymour saying, obviously Mr Peters is getting ready to go with Labour. Is this just kind of predictable argy-bargy that we can expect a lot more of next year?
Yeah, absolutely. As we just sort of adverted to, the coalition vote is still enough to form a government in the majority of polls, but the relative power and the relative share of those votes is very much up for grabs. New Zealand First have certainly been making the most of it over the past year. Their vote has really increased this year. ACT is down. It seems to have recovered a little, and National has probably been the big loser out of this sort of three-way pushing and pulling. And you see that National now, they've been making sort of moves to kind of stake out their own policy areas, but they actually released election policy on Sunday with a very well-received speech from the Prime Minister about increasing KiwiSaver contributions. So, look, absolutely, you're going to see a lot more of this. I think you'll see a bit more, not even so much agree to disagree, but more like we've seen from Peters this week.
Just saying what you want to say.
Yeah, look, sure we passed it, and we're going to campaign strongly against it. I mean, there's no real novelty in Winston Peters furiously repudiating the actions of governments he's been a part of. It's really just the speed that's the difference here.
Yeah.
The list is growing, though, of the
Super's going to get interesting, by the way, but carry on.
Oh, and asset sales. How that's going to land with New Zealand First and Winston Peters' comments. He wouldn't say if the Prime Minister was doing a good job. He's been highly critical on the state of the economy. So if this is your coalition partner saying this, wait till next year. I think it's going to be gloves off. And they're all competing, as Ben pointed out, for similar votes. And National look like they're standing in the middle of the street, going to get hit by both sides. So whether the Prime Minister's, sort of bland, battered off approach is going to keep working next year, who knows?
On the KiwiSaver, it'll be interesting now that they're proposing this move to 12% total, whether that is going to be followed up by policy about moving on age. It's interesting in Australia. I hadn't fully appreciated that Australia is actually means tested its super. Once you reach, I think if you've got it leaves the home out of it. But if you've got investments over 350 or so, then you start losing a proportion of your national super entitlement. But it will be...
On the other hand, the savings in Australia are now apparently so great that the government's having to do a sort of education job trying to get retirees to spend their money because they've saved so much with salary sacrifices, etc., that it's actually tying up money that should be in consumption.
Well, that's what was done in the past. This is what's happening now to to people who are already under economic strain. But my point is whether that policy announced yesterday is going to be followed up by things like changing the age or other entitlements.
And we see in Australia there are tax incentives, which the government says we've got government contributions, which is sort of our equivalent of that. I mean, they've got $4 trillion in their Australian super fund. In New Zealand, I think the average is only $37,000.
Well,
so
1975 and all that. But anyway,
well,
carry
that's
on.
the thing, the best time to do this was 40 years ago. The next best time is to start today. But then also I think very real risk around the employer contributions, whether that becomes part of the total remuneration package and basically is a way to circumvent the intent of this, which is to save up for the retirement. But in terms of the politics of it, I can just imagine the strategists, over planning for this 12 months out for the election, almost a perfect policy in the sense everyone agrees we've got a savings problem in this country. It's part of our economic woes, the lack of productivity, the lack of investment, a policy that Labour is unlikely to criticise given they brought in KiwiSaver, something that New Zealand First has recently put a policy out. You tick all the boxes. It's something you don't have to pay for because really it's employees and employers paying for it at a time where the government's made their decisions. They don't have much money to spend because they've prioritised other constituencies. The only downside is that it reminds everyone about the halving of government contributions only at the budget this year. But they're, I guess, hoping that people will forget about that and it'll just be broadly welcomed.
The Greens, meanwhile, the pledge to repeal fast-track mining projects, the Finance Minister coming out and calling it, quote, doolally economic vandalism. We haven't heard so much from the Greens of late, and in part they won't be sorry about that after some of the controversies they've had. But they're going to have to start staking out their place in this increasingly busy competitive field ahead of the election.
Oh, I think it's a smart strategy for them. For the last 2 years we've been talking about the Greens rather than about what the Greens want to be talking about. So it's a chance to sort of get their national agenda and talk about their issues. They have been quiet on the environment, so I think this is them reminding their voters and their potential voters, they're still there for the environment. They have a different vision for the economy than the old coal and mining and seabed mining, which is going under the fast track. Remember, it was James Shaw under the previous leadership model that actually said they weren't going to acknowledge the legitimacy of these fast-track consents. So it's not like the new Greens are doing something different from the old Greens. But I think, they do have a risk that when you have someone like James Shaw going, able to build those relationships with businesses, really have a pro-jobs, pro-economy message, they probably need to do something on that side as well.
Absolutely, and if the Greens, cared to sort of hit back at New Zealand First's sort of fulminating and about this, they would probably get some video footage of Shane Jones on the Marine and Coastal Area Act retrospective law, saying Parliament is the highest court in the land and nobody can restrain us, and so.
Or meet me at the ballot box, indeed.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, they seem to be just ignoring Shane Jones. It looks like Jones is obsessed with the Greens. Every second video he makes is about the Greens and attacking them, and the Greens seem to be just absolutely ignoring it.
I think the Greens can look forward to a bit of a return of the party vote from Te Pāti Māori, a very young voter base, which just hazarding a guess here might become increasingly disillusioned with the sort of nonsense that's happening over there. That also is that party splits apart, or does sort of cellular division or whatever. The Greens might sort of reassert themselves in areas like the treaty space, where actually, a lot of their spokespeople are much more impressive than the Te Pāti Māori MPs.
All right. I haven't mentioned Labour yet, and they're still keeping up the small target.
That's how they're polling well. It's pretty much writ large.
Interesting candidates. You've got Craig Rennie now in Wellington Bays. I think that'll be quite a contest to watch and be quite an interesting policy-heavy debate, I imagine.
What does it replace Wellington Bays? I'm sorry.
Rongotai.
Rongotai, which is where Julianne Genter is the incumbent.
And then I see over the weekend, Aisha Verrill won the selection seat against Greg O'Connor, which, if they want to take back the seat from the Greens' Tamitha Paul, I think she's probably a better candidate. But I do feel sorry for Greg. He's a candidate when the tide was going against Labour, was able to win in the Haru seat against the National Finance Minister, Nicola Willis. He's someone who's able to reach across
Let's see
boundaries.
whether Willis runs and where. Which seat would you pick for her? Would it be the old Wellington Central now becoming
Wellington North?
I think
Wellington
I think political watchers would love to see Wellington Bays. I think that's. Rennie would probably love to see that as well.
Yes.
I think having a personal beef with the finance minister is probably a big selling point in that electorate. But look, those electorates are going to be very, very tough for National.
They always are, indeed. But it'll be interesting to watch. Now, COP30. New Zealand's Climate Minister has gone there for the second week, and there's been a couple of issues, including over the policy with respect to fossil fuels. There's a perception that globally this endeavour is stalling. Obviously, some of the biggest players, the biggest in the United States, absent. But also he's gone after a long list of repeals or rollbacks of New Zealand's climate policy and targets in the case of methane.
Oh, I sort of shake my head at the COPs. What are we up to? COP 30 now.
Years.
Sort of the worst, best hopes for the planet. I mean, the fact that in 2025 that we can have a deal that contains no direct reference to the things that are causing the heating, fossil fuels, I think sort of says something about the dire state we're in. But for our government, they went there and they didn't have a particularly great story to tell. The bipartisanship, which I think we saw a lot of hope in this country, that National and Labour and the Greens were coming together with long-term policy. That's just been ripped up with the methane policy changes, potentially backtracking on Paris commitments, the clean car discount, the methane emissions, the Zero Carbon Act being softened and reduced role for the Independent Climate Change Commission. It's no surprise that he got a Fossil of the Day award. He was trying to shrug that off this morning. But, National doesn't have a particularly compelling story that they're acting on climate change. Yet when we look at New Zealand, I understand the Parliamentary Commission of the Environment just this morning published some research showing for the first time the costs of adaptation, extreme weather events, are higher than the stuff we're doing to reduce the emissions, the mitigations. I was at a ED&Z conference last week and Brad Olsen had a fascinating slide. We used to have about 5 to 10 days of the country in a state of civil emergency somewhere. Since 2019, it's been 60 plus days every year since. So we've entered this new normal where climate is bringing real costs, and the sooner we actually take action to reduce those costs, the better.
This is an area, I think, where National are very constrained by their coalition partners.
Have they had to roll back as much as they had to roll back?
I think,
really? I mean, some of it I didn't even know existed and it's being rolled back,
I think if they were determined to put, their foot down and put a stake in the ground, obviously they would be able to, veto any of these kinds of changes. What happens, though, is that, or what's been happening over the last year in particular, is that National electorate MPs are getting a lot of pressure, particularly in those rural areas. They're getting a lot of pressure from voters who are essentially sort of threatening to go over to New Zealand First or Act, saying, why are you buying into all this climate nonsense? So Simon Watts, who I think, in the sort of John Key kind of era, National government, would have been a very progressive, climate minister, is really hemmed in here. And, I think, again,
What's happening to the ETS price? This is the other thing. We've been here before. So they delinked the ETS from their international commitments, right? Which in simplest terms means they don't have to rely on it as much, the ETS price, the carbon price, as much to make up for other things they're not doing. Was that truly necessary, Gareth? Was that a way of throwing your hands up and saying we're going to miss targets? We're just going to start to increasingly ignore our targets? What?
Ignore our international obligations that we've signed up. We went to the world saying we will do X and Y by Y and not meet it. And rather than actually purchase the credits to fulfil those obligations, looks like we're just going to walk away from it.
But now the carbon price is down. So this is the centrepiece of your policy, and you've undermined it, right?
And actually, the market is voting with its dollar in a sense. After that announcement, the price plummeted. It rebounded a little bit.
It's still down.
And the fact that so many regular auctions now are failing is a sign of the lack of the market's, I think, lack of view that the government's committed to these policies.
Very good. We shall leave it there. Interesting times indeed on all fronts, and truly appreciate your time as always. Ben Thomas, Gareth Hughes.